All right, game of the week this week in college football. Georgia on the road at Alabama, two top 5 teams. Both teams undefeated. Georgia listed as about a 2-point favorite heading into this game. Jalen Milroe versus Carson Beck, round 2. Jalen Milroe, of course, came out on top. Alabama beating Georgia in the SEC championship game last season. This a rare regular season meeting between Georgia and Alabama, of course, with the SEC having divisions. These two teams did not play every single year. Played on occasion, but not every single year. Division's gone now, so maybe we'll get to see this game a little bit more often. We're going to dive into this game today. I'm going to give you a prediction, tell you which way I'm leaning. But first, shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. Do yourself a favor and head on over to prizepicks.com. They are the absolute best when it comes to daily fantasy sports, and it couldn't be easier to use. Pick a player and then just pick more or less. Sign up using the promo code Uncle Lou. When you sign up, it's going to ask you for your email address and a promo code. Just type in your email address, promo code Uncle Lou. That's one word, uppercase letters, no spaces, Uncle Lou. And they have a great bonus for you. Make any $5 play, and whether you win or lose, they're going to give you $50. It's literally that simple. PrizePicks.com, promo code Uncle Lou. Since we're talking about the Georgia-Bama game in today's video, let's take a look at some of the Georgia-Bama numbers over on Prize Picks, and I'll show you how easy it is. We'll start here. Quarterback Jalen Milroe. Will he have more than 1.5 pass touchdowns? I'm going to say yes, more. Carson Beck, more or less than 8.5 rush yards. Now, maybe this is the homer in me. No, Carson Beck cannot run around like Jalen Milroe, but he can pick up a first down or two on 3rd and 5. I'm going to say more. God, I'm really going out on a limb there. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Ryan Williams, more or less than 45.5 receiving yards. I'm going less. He's been really good this year. That's the 17-year-old that skipped his senior year that's sort of taken everybody by storm this year. SEC secondaries will be a little bit tougher than what he's seen so far. I expect a lot of press coverage, man coverage, bump and run, physical type of stuff that maybe he's not used to. I think Georgia might be able to contain him. Let's hope anyway. But anyway, so that's 3 picks. I have less on Ryan Williams' yards, and I have more on Carson Beck's yards rushing, and more than 1.5 pass touchdowns for Jalen Milroe. So you can see the 3 picks here. $20 to win 105. All you have to do is 5 to win $26. And whether you win or lose this bet, they're going to give you $50 if you use the promo code Uncle Lou when you sign up. So head on over to prizepicks.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. All right, speaking of Jalen Milroe and Carson Beck, let's start with Jalen Milroe. Because like a lot of players, like most players, I think there's some things he does really, really well, and there's some things he does not so well, right? And Bama, I think, and Kalen DeBoer have done a good job this season of putting him in positions to take advantage of the things he does well while limiting the things maybe he doesn't do so well, right? One of the best deep balls in all of college football, period, bar none. Say what you want about Jalen Milroe. The guy can throw a deep ball. He puts it on the money almost every single time. And Bama's got some wide receivers that can run down there and catch it. Ryan Williams off to a good start there. By the way, did you know that Ryan Williams is 17 years old? Of course, you know, you can't watch 5 minutes of a broadcast about Alabama without the announcers mentioning that he's 17 years old. But it is remarkable what he's done here early in the year. He of course, skipped his senior year of high school, enrolled at Bama. Not only was he good enough to do that, he's good enough to start, and he's been very productive there at Alabama. That'll be somebody that Georgia needs to keep an eye on at the wide receiver position for sure. But so Jalen Milroe can throw the deep ball. There's no doubt about it. And he can scramble. He can run around. He's one of the most dangerous quarterbacks in all of college football when he takes off running. There's no disputing any of that. Hate Bama, love Bama, or indifferent towards Bama. Those are obvious Jalen Milroe strengths, okay? It's also true that he's not going to sustain a drive passing the ball down the field 10 and 15 yards at a time. That's just not an area he excels in. Now, that tends not to hurt Bama in the long run because they do hit a lot of explosive plays over the top from Milroe to those wide receivers, and they can hit you for big plays on the ground with the running backs too, Justice Haynes and Jam Miller. But when it comes to Jalen Milroe, Alabama, of course, is going to try to protect him, and it's going to be Georgia's job to try to get to him. And when you look at last year's matchup, I think like this is an area where Georgia fell short here. They made some, what in my mind were questionable defensive decisions. A lot of 2- and 3-man rushes on Jalen Milroe with sometimes 2 spies on him. I'm kind of always of the belief it's better to pressure a quarterback than not. Now, there's some obvious risk involved in doing that. If you send extra guys at a quarterback, whether it's Jalen Milroe or anyone else, that obviously opens you up and makes you more susceptible to the deep ball over the top. Especially if those rushers don't get home. But I just don't believe in letting a quarterback sit back in the pocket for 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds. It's hard to cover wide receivers. It's even harder to cover them for 8, 9, 10 plus seconds straight back there in the secondary. I'm in favor of trying to get pressure on a quarterback. We'll see what Georgia does with that. But those are, I mean, this is obvious with Milroe. You've got to watch out for the deep ball. Bama lives off of that. They one of the most explosive teams in the country if you look at the numbers, and of course his ability to extend plays. And that's the other thing. If you do pressure Milroe and you get back there and you get around him, you got to get him on the ground. You can't let him escape and get loose, because if you do that, there's going to be a lot of green grass in front of him, because the DBs are all going to be 25 yards downfield trying to cover their wide receivers. So it's going to be critical for Georgia, I think, to both get pressure on Jalen Milroe and get to Jalen Milroe and get him down onto the ground. Now, Alabama can run the ball, too. In fact, they're one of the best rushing teams in the SEC, in my opinion. They've got 2 really, really good running backs with Justice Haynes and Jam Miller, and their offensive line has played really, really well outside of the South Florida game. And I understand the players that were missing there, and they're back now. So do I think that Georgia is going to see the version of Alabama that played the first 56 minutes against South Florida? No, clearly that's not going to happen. First of all, both of these teams, I think, are going to be up for this game. I think you're going to get close to the best available version of both of these teams in this game. Bama's not going to come out sluggish and slow like they did against South Florida. I just don't believe that for a second. I also think Georgia's not going to come out like they did on the road at Kentucky a couple of weeks ago. Same thing, slow, sluggish, couldn't get anything going offensively, no real rhythm, didn't seem to be into the game, that kind of thing. I think you're going to get both teams' best efforts here. Defensively for Alabama, they've got a really, really good front seven, and this is what hurt Georgia, another thing that hurt Georgia last year in the SEC championship game. In fact, if you were to point to one thing, I think, reason Georgia lost last year to Alabama, remember it was a 3-point game, 27-24, Bama on top. Bama dominated both lines of scrimmage in that game. Defensively and offensively, Bama had their way with Georgia in the trenches. And I think this is the biggest concern for Georgia heading into this game, is that could happen again. Because we could talk to her blue in the face about Jalen Milroe and his ability to throw the deep ball or his struggles to throw sort of the intermediate ball. Jalen Milroe is going to hit you with a bunch of quick passes and passes, passes at or behind the line of scrimmage, quick slants, things like that. And he's going to hit you with a bunch of deep balls. What he's not going to do is sit in the pocket and progress through his reads and throw a bunch of 18-yard crossing routes over to him. That's not who he is. He's not going to do that. And that's not what happened in the SEC championship game. Bama dominated Georgia on the lines of scrimmage in the SEC championships. So Milroe was able to sit in the pocket, make the deep throws. And when Georgia did get pressure on Milroe, they couldn't get him down. And that's got to improve in this game, I think, if Georgia's going to have a chance to win. Same thing when Georgia had the ball. Bama's front four, I think, or front seven, won the battle in the trenches there in that game. Georgia had a hard time running the ball, never really established anything consistent on the ground. And generally speaking, over the years, the team that runs the ball better in these big matchups tends to be the team that wins the game. I think Bama has ran the ball much better than Georgia up to this point in the season. Now, we can go back and forth and debate and say, well, Georgia played Clemson and Kentucky. That's probably 2 top 15 defenses, whereas Alabama played South Florida and Wisconsin, and those aren't 2 top. I mean, we can do that whole song and dance if you want to, but I watched both of those Bama games, Wisconsin and South Florida. I watched both those Georgia games, Clemson and Kentucky. Alabama looks like they have the better lines of scrimmage at this point in the season to me so far this year, and I think that's a big concern for Georgia. I don't think we're going to get the South Florida version of Alabama, like I mentioned. I don't think we're going to get the Kentucky version of Georgia, like I mentioned. But I honestly think if the best version of both teams show up, I think Alabama probably wins in the trenches again this time. You have the other obvious advantage of this being a home game for Alabama, so the crowd and how all that plays into it. And really, for Georgia offensively, as talented as the pieces are, they really haven't looked great at any point this season outside of maybe the second half against Clemson. I don't put much stock in the Tennessee Tech game for Georgia, just like I don't put much stock in the, Western Kentucky game for Bama in week 1. It's just these elite dominant teams, the top 4, 5, 6 teams, when they play these lower level teams, it's hard to really be too happy or too mad about anything you see in those types of games. Because in a lot of situations, the coaches are just trying things out. They're rotating different players in and out. It's early in the year. They're trying to see which version of maybe the offensive line works better and rotating this defensive tackle in this situation. And there's just a lot of that going on. So it's hard to judge a lot. But, you take Bama in the South Florida game and the Wisconsin game. You take Georgia to Clemson game and the Kentucky game. And outside of those, that second half against Clemson, Georgia has struggled to score. In fact, they haven't scored a touchdown. The one against Kentucky late in the game and the second half explosion against Clemson. But the first half against Clemson, not good offensively. The entire game against Kentucky, not good offensively. And even though I don't expect that version of Georgia to show up in this game against Tuscaloosa, there are things you can take out of the Kentucky game for Georgia and the Clemson game for Georgia that I think has to give you some concern heading into this game, again, with the lines of scrimmage. Bama's done a pretty good job this season of protecting Milroe outside of that South Florida game where they had some shuffling around going on the offensive line. Defensively for Bama, I do think the secondary could potentially be taken advantage of, but it's going to take the right circumstances and set of events. It's going to take a team that can give their quarterback time in the pocket. It's going to take wide receivers that can beat those DBs. And it's going to take a quarterback, of course, who can make the throws and take advantage of that. So we talked about Carson Beck, we talked about Jalen Milroe. We'll move over and talk about Carson Beck. They're basically opposites to me, Carson Beck and Jalen Milroe. When I look at the things that Jalen Milroe does well, those are the things that Carson Beck does not do well. The things that Jalen Milroe tends to struggle with, those are the things that Carson Beck does really, really well. Carson Beck reminds me more of kind of your prototypical big, tall, drop back NFL style pocket passer. He can move around some. He can escape some pressure a little. He can pick up a first down for you with his legs on 3rd and 5 a couple of times a game, right? We've seen him do it now for last year and through 3 games this year. He's not running any 70 or 80 yard touchdowns. He's not making any highlight or circus type scrambles out of the backfield like a Jalen Milroe is going to do, right? He also struggles to throw the deep ball, which is alarming because most people consider the deep ball to be one of the easiest throws to make. It's basically just timing and arm strength. How much air do you put under the ball based on how fast the guy is and things like that. And Jalen Milroe throws one of the best deep balls in the game. Carson Beck now for the second year in a row has struggled to hit wide open receivers if they're more than 40 yards downfield. We saw it all last year with Carson Beck. It's not necessarily a Joe Milton situation. If you remember the QB from Tennessee who tended to always overthrow the go route by 10 yards. Carson Beck will overthrow a deep ball, and then in the next quarter, he'll underthrow a deep ball. And then in the third quarter, he'll throw it behind the receiver. And in the fourth quarter, he'll lead the receiver too much on the deep ball. It's just very inconsistent with the deep ball. Now, where Carson Beck, I think, is at his best is before the ball is snapped, all of the mental stuff, the reads you have to make, getting Georgia in and out of the right plays, recognizing coverages, stunts, blitzes, pressures, all of that kind of thing. And then dropping back in the pocket, reading the defense, making his progressions, going through his reads, and throwing an 18-yard crossing route or out route or in route or whatever on a dime. He does that better than almost anybody in college football. That requires a lot of things to go right to be able to work. He's got to have the time in the pocket, obviously, to allow those receivers to run those 15, 18, 20-yard routes. He's got to have the time to do that. The receivers have to be able to create separation and get open. And I think that can happen with Georgia's receivers against Alabama's secondary. There are a bunch of new pieces back there in Alabama's secondary. I think Malachi Moore is the only returning starting secondary member from last year's Alabama team. They lost Caleb Downs to the portal, lost a couple other guys to the NFL, lost some graduation and transfer. Now, they've got some guys back there with starting experience in other places, but in terms of playing as a group at Alabama, they're still relatively young, new, and inexperienced, and have not been tested. Wisconsin can't throw the ball. Their starting quarterback went down on the first drive of the game. The backup couldn't throw the ball. South Florida didn't throw the ball very well. And, of course, Western Kentucky is what it is. So if Georgia is able to protect Carson Beck and allow him time in the pocket to make his reads and progressions, I think Carson Beck can have success against the Alabama secondary. If those other things can happen. And we'll see if it does. Georgia running the ball. Outside of the second half versus Clemson, Georgia has been one of the worst running teams on the planet. They couldn't run the ball to save their life in the first half against Clemson. Second half, they exploded. Put Nate Frazier in, the true freshman. He goes nuts in the second half. Last 2 weeks ago against Kentucky, couldn't run the ball at all really in the first half. ETN comes in the second half, and he provides a little bit of a spark there in the second half and got it going a little bit on the ground. But overall, Georgia's running game has been very disappointing this year relative to the preseason expectations. Some of that's on the offensive line. Some of that's on Branson Robinson, who has just been horrible. Look, injuries are terrible. Nobody likes them. And, this guy missed a year. He had a bad knee injury. He's worked his way back, and now we're seeing him play for the first time. And I'm happy for him that he's back and recovered and healthy. But the reality is this is big boy football, and Branson Robinson's not getting it done. That's just the fact of the matter. It's sad. I hate it. I hoped the best for him. But for whatever reason, whether it be he can't get over some sort of maybe mental hurdle, maybe he's not 100%, maybe he's lost a step post-surgery. I don't know what the reasoning is. But you don't have to watch too much Branson Robinson to realize that he's just not very good right now. It should be ETN and Frazier should be RB1 and RB2 in whatever type of order and rotation. Outside of maybe a 3rd and 1 or 4th and 1 or a goal line situation, I honestly don't see much need or use right now for Branson Robinson running the ball at Georgia. He's just been very disappointing this year. Again, I'm not crapping on the kid. He had a bad injury, and sometimes people are able to come back from that. Nick Chubb, sometimes they're not. Branson Robinson. So it is what it is. Wide receiver position, Georgia's wide receivers are going to have to play a lot better than they played against Kentucky. And I'm not just talking about running routes and catching the ball. They got to block better. Georgia whiffed on way too many blocks on the edge in that Kentucky game. Tight ends, Lawson Lucky, Oscar Delp, the wide receivers, way too many missed or blown assignments on blocking opportunities on running plays. Georgia has to have that from their tight ends and wide receivers to have a successful run game, and they didn't have it. On top of that, Tate Ratledge, one of their most experienced and best offensive linemen, is out. Now, Georgia's got 6 or 7 probable NFL players along that offensive line that they can rotate in and out. So I don't think that this is necessarily a huge step backwards as an offensive line, having to losing Ratledge. But he was an experienced guy. And it's one less body you have available now on that offensive line. But they're going to have to play better. The defensive line is going to have to play better, obviously. Michael Williams should be back this week. Probably Georgia's second most talented player on defense. Malachi Starks, the safety, I think is the best safety in America. Caleb Downs may end up being better than Malachi Starks, but Malachi's in his 3rd year. Caleb Downs heading into his 2nd year. We'll see how he does this year at Ohio State. But I think right now, Malachi Starks is the best safety in football. Again, Caleb Downs may have a higher ceiling. I'm not knocking Caleb Downs. The kid's elite, obviously. There's no question about it. No, but Malachi Starks will be a 1st-round pick. He might be the most talented player on Georgia's defense, but if he's not, but Michael Williams is a close second. He got hurt in the Clemson game. He's been out ever since then. Let's hope he's back and available for this Clemson game because Georgia's going to need him. You play a quarterback like Jalen Milroe, your outside pass rushers become extremely important, both in terms of pressuring the quarterback, but also making sure they contain him and that he doesn't get outside and break any of these huge runs. That's going to fall on Michael Williams, hopefully, if he's healthy, and Jalen Walker on the other end. They should get a couple of guys back along the defensive line too. Warren Brinson and Jordan Hall hopefully will be available for this game. I think this is going to be a great game. It almost always is when these two teams play. There's been 2 blowouts in the last 5 times. The national championship game wasn't particularly close. I think it was 41-24 or something like that. Georgia won. And then the SEC championship 2 years ago, not this past year, 3 seasons ago, the 2021 SEC championship game, Alabama won by a couple of scores. But last year's SEC championship game was a close one. A lot of close games in this series, and I think we're probably going to get another close game here. Here's something to keep in mind too. Alabama is a home underdog. Very rare. Very rare. I think this is the first time Alabama's been an underdog at home since Nick Saban's first year, 2007. Alabama's only been an underdog anywhere they've played, I believe, 4 times in the last 10 years. All 4 of those times, they were underdogs against Georgia. They're 1-3 in those games. They're 1-3. Georgia is. Bama is 3-1 against Georgia when Georgia's favored in the last 10 years or whatever it's been. Alabama tends to win these games, is what I'm getting at here. During Kirby's time in Georgia, what is he, 1-5 against Bama? Now, Kalen DeBoer is in now. Nick Saban is out. It's hard to find like a comparison with Kalen DeBoer to see how he might do in this game. But if you think about last year, he was the head coach at Washington. They, of course, ended up making the national title game. But twice during the season, they were an underdog to the same team. Washington was an underdog to Oregon in the regular season, and Washington was an underdog to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game. And Washington won both of those games as underdogs, with Kalen DeBoer as head coach. So it's a familiar spot here for Kalen DeBoer, being an underdog against another one of the big boys in your conference, right? In this case, Georgia, last year, Oregon. And Kalen DeBoer has shown that he can get the job done in these situations. A lot of pressure with this game, I think, on both teams. If you're Kalen DeBoer, you're sort of living in Nick Saban's shadow, and there's some positives to that and some potential drawbacks as well. I think this is Kalen DeBoer's first opportunity to kind of start to get out from under the shadow of Nick Saban. Nick Saban dominated Georgia in his time there. That's just a fact. He had 2 losses. In his entire time at Alabama, he lost to Georgia twice. He lost in Tuscaloosa in 2007, I believe, and lost to Georgia in the national championship game in 2021. He beat Georgia every other time. So a win here at home in front of the home fans over a really good Georgia team, a top 5 Georgia team, would go a long way, I think, in Kalen DeBoer starting to not separate himself from Nick Saban. Nick Saban still has ties to Bama. He always will. But sort of start to create his own sort of name and legacy. And it's real early. He's 3-4 games in. You know, it's way too early to be starting to talk about Kalen DeBoer's legacy at Bama, but this is the type of game that at the end of his time at Bama, whenever that time comes, it's this type of game that he'll be judged by, right? When you're the head coach of Bama, it's the big games, it's the SEC championship games, it's the playoffs, it's the national titles. That's how a Bama coach is judged in the long run. And I think this is the first one of those games that eventually will be looked back on when Kalen DeBoer's legacy at Alabama is discussed. His first big game of his career at Alabama, the home game against Georgia. So there is some pressure there. With Georgia, I think the pressure comes from a different spot. They were dominated by Alabama during Nick Saban's time there. And it was real easy if you're Georgia or you're a Georgia fan to look at that and go, you know, this really sucks that we lost to Alabama again. But Nick Saban's the greatest coach of all time, and what can you do but sort of give the guy credit, right? Well, now he's gone. Saban's gone. That sort of boogeyman excuse is gone. And they've got a new guy in, and Kirby is now sort of the grizzled SEC veteran coach, right? Who's at the top of his game and all that. He needs to go in there and win this game to solidify himself as the top dog in the SEC, to solidify Georgia, I think, as the best program in the SEC. It's a game it feels like Georgia needs to win from a perception standpoint. How people look at the SEC, how people view Georgia and Alabama, and how they view Georgia and Alabama in comparison to one another. It feels like it's more of a must-win game for Kirby in that respect than it does Kalen. Bama fans want to win every game, and I understand that. And they could win this one too. But if Bama loses this game, it's not going to mean that much in the end for Kalen DeBoer, right? He's an underdog. It's his first year there. You get a lot of extra leash or rope as a first-year head coach that maybe Kalen DeBoer won't get in year 3 or year 4 or year 5. So from that respect, there's pressure on Kirby to win this game. The other issue is when you look at the schedules down the road for both teams. Now, we're in the era of a 12-team playoff now. So the loser of this game is not eliminated or out of contention for anything that they set forward for themselves as a goal in the preseason. The loser of this game can still make the SEC title game. The loser of this game could still win the SEC title. The loser of this game could still make the playoffs. The loser of this game could still get a first-round bye. All of that stuff will still be on the table because we're in the age of the 12-team playoff. There's no divisions within the SEC, so the loser of this game could win out and find themselves in the SEC championship game and a playoff spot. All of that is true. However, when you look at the remaining schedules for each of these teams, you start with Alabama, and you start looking for, okay, which of the games remaining on their schedule is there at least close to a reasonable chance that they could be challenged or potentially lose, right? Oklahoma and Missouri, that's really it for Bama. They play LSU, but I don't think anybody's all that impressed with LSU this year. Auburn is literally circling the drain. And that game's in Bama this year, I believe. So even when Bama does struggle with Auburn, that tends to be on the road at Auburn. They get them in Tuscaloosa. So it feels like if Bama loses this game, they're probably still going 10-2 at the worst, which is going to get them in the playoffs, no question about it. I guess it's possible if they lose this game that they also lose to Mizzou and also lose to Oklahoma, but I don't see that happening. I mean, I've watched Missouri and Oklahoma both play. I wouldn't pick either one of those to beat Alabama right now. They avoid Ole Miss. Tennessee is the other one. I didn't mean to do that, Tennessee fans. I'm leaving out Tennessee. They do play on the road at Tennessee. That's the most likely game they would lose. So Georgia, on the other hand, okay, so Bama plays at Tennessee, and then they've got at Oklahoma and home against Auburn. I think at worst they go 2-1 there. I think they beat Oklahoma. I think they beat Missouri. Maybe they lose to Tennessee. So if Bama drops this game, it looks like they're probably still going to go 10-2, right? Which is going to get them into playoffs. Georgia, on the other hand, has a much tougher schedule the rest of the way. If Georgia were to lose this game to Alabama, then there are some games down the road from Georgia that are going to be pressure-packed because Georgia is going to be painted into a corner in terms of wins and losses and trying to get into the playoffs. Their next big test after the Bama game comes in about 4 weeks on the road at Texas. Then in back-to-back weeks in November, they play on the road at Ole Miss and home against Tennessee. So Georgia plays 4 of the top 6 teams in the country right now. 3 of them they play on the road. So the odds that Georgia runs the table there is almost 0. But what you don't want to do if you're Georgia is lose the first one, because then everyone after that becomes bigger and bigger and more important and more pressure-packed. And on top of that, 2 of the remaining 3 are still on the road at Texas, at Ole Miss, before you finally get Tennessee at home, which may be the best team of the bunch. So if Georgia loses this game, they're really putting themselves behind the 8 ball in terms of almost having to win out if they want to make it to the SEC championship game. And really, margin of error, 10-2, they could only really lose 1 more game probably to guarantee themselves a spot 5 through 12 in the 12-team playoff. So from that respect, it seems like there's probably more pressure on Georgia. Georgia is my favorite team. I've never tried to hide that. I love college football. I watch a ton of games a day. I'll watch almost any college football game, but Georgia is my favorite team. I think everybody that's watching this video probably knows that, but I have picked against Georgia at times in the past. And I'm going to have to pick against them again here. It's not specifically because they beat Kentucky by 1 on the road, which I've heard a million times over the last 2 weeks. It's not specifically that. It's more how they played and the areas in which they didn't play well in that game at Kentucky. And it's the lines of scrimmage. And like I mentioned back towards the beginning of the video, in my mind, the line of scrimmage play is what cost them the SEC championship game against Alabama. And I don't think Georgia right now has the lines of scrimmage to win this game against Bama. The fan in me obviously hopes I'm wrong. I want Georgia to win every game, just like you want your team to win every game. But in Tuscaloosa, game day is there. Kalen DeBoer's first SEC game, his first major home game. Georgia does have some key pieces coming back from injury, but they're coming back from injury. They haven't played in a few weeks. Will they be rusty? Will they even play? Michael Williams, Warren Brinson on the defense. And there's 3 defensive linemen that even if we get them back, they're coming back after not playing for several weeks. It just seems like a recipe for another close Georgia loss to me, which is heartbreaking for me and Georgia fans when it comes to Alabama. I feel like this is Georgia's biggest game of the year because of the perception around Georgia and Bama and Georgia's perceived inability to beat Bama. Well, it's not even a perceived inability to beat them. It's a reality that they've look, Bama is the only team in the country that has beaten Georgia since 2020. No one else. Nobody has beaten Georgia since 2020 except Alabama. And in that time, Georgia has beat everyone else in the top 10. But they can't. But Bama just keeps beating them. In that time frame, Georgia has beat Ohio State, Michigan, Oregon, Clemson, Florida State, TCU, LSU, Tennessee, if I didn't name them, Ole Miss last year when they were in the top 10. I mean, they've literally just beaten a who's who of college football. But they can't beat Bama. And I haven't seen anything, I haven't seen enough improvement. Georgia's defensive line, even if healthy, is basically the same defensive line that got dominated by Alabama last year. And I think Alabama's offensive line is better this year than it was last year. Georgia's offensive line has not looked great this year. They struggled against Clemson. I know Clemson's a good defense, but so is Bama. So telling me, well, Georgia only struggled, offensive line only struggled against Clemson because they have such a good front four. Well, Bama's got a good front four. Well, they only struggled against Kentucky because, Kentucky always plays Georgia tough. Alabama always plays Georgia tough. These excuses that I'm hearing from Georgia fans aren't excuses that make me feel better. If anything, they're having the opposite effect. They're like, yeah, I agree. And Bama's that too. Bama plays us tough too. Bama's physical too. Bama's got a good front four too. I hope I'm wrong. I think it's going to be a close game, but Bama, a 2-point underdog at home. No, I'll take Bama plus the 2. I hope it's a good game, college football fan point of view. We'll see. And obviously, if one team or the other gets blown out, that will mean something totally different than if somebody loses this game by 3, right? Georgia loses by 3 or Bama loses by 3. You probably sulk around for a day or two, but then you go, you know what? Those are 2 really good teams, and we lost by 3. Let's get on to the next one, and maybe we'll see them again. You lose this game by 3 touchdowns, that's going to be hard to stomach for either team. So we'll see what happens. I am a Georgia fan. I'll be rooting for Georgia during the game on Saturday, like I always am. I'm going to make the hype and hate video on Friday. So Georgia fans, don't, I know y'all are probably upset with me. I try to separate my heart from my head when I make my predictions. And it's just, I've been watching college football for the last 10 years, just like you have. You really got to go out on a limb, I feel like, to pick Georgia to win this game. And it's just a limb I can't go out on right now. I'm going to take Bama at home to win. But Friday Friday, hype and hate video. And we'll sing a different tune. We'll sing a different tune on that. Have a good morning.